Okay, hi everyone. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. My name is Aaron Hiltner. I'm a lecturer at the Institute of the Americas at University College London. And we're really lucky tonight to be joined by three guests to help celebrate Yael Mabat's book launch. So I'm going to introduce our speakers and then I will hand it over to Yael. So Dr. Yael Mabat is visiting scholar at the Institute of the Americas, University College London, a postdoctoral fellow at Tel Aviv University, and a lecturer at Ben Gurion University, Israel. Her research focuses on modern Christianity in the Americas with a particular interest in transnational religious encounters and how they shape local, social, economic, and political structures. Her forthcoming book, the one that we're really celebrating tonight, is Sacrifice and Regeneration, Seventh-day Adventism and Religious Transformation in the Andes, published by the University of Nebraska Press. The first person we have to comment after Yael's presentation is Dr. Anna Kott, who is assistant professor at LSE. She is a Latin American historian with expertise in 20th century politics, cultural history, and rural development. She gained her PhD in history at the University of Cambridge in 2015 with a thesis on land reform in Peru. And her first manuscript, Land Without Masters, Agrarian Reform and Political Change Under Peru's Military Government, was published by the University of Texas Press in 2021. Our second commenter is Pablo Drino, who's a professor of Latin American history at UCL, the Institute of the Americas. He was co-editor of the Journal of Latin American Studies. Professor Drino's main research focuses on the history of Peru in late 19th century and early 20th centuries. His thematic interests include labor history and state formation, racism and exclusion, gender and sexuality, the social history of medicine, and memory and historiography. So Yael, when you're ready, I'll hand over to you. Thanks.
Okay, great. So I'm just gonna share a presentation. Okay, hold on. Let me just. Wait a second. Yeah. Okay, so first of all, I really would like to thank Aaron, Paulo, and Anna for this event. This is my first book, and it is also the first time I am presenting it. So I am honored and really very excited. I began this project before anyone could imagine a Zoom event, and in what to now seems to be a completely different world. And when I did, many people kind of thought it was odd. They seemed puzzled about the fact that someone Jewish would be interested in the history of a small mission station in faraway Peru that belonged to a very, very particular form of US Christianity. The reactions I received could be a topic for anthropological research in their own right. I was asked if I was Seventh-day Adventist or any one of my family members, if the work was perhaps commissioned by the Adventist Church. But more than anything, people thought I chose this topic because I was actually interested in converting myself. And this was a way for me to sort of get to know the church or something of that sort before I made a decision. It seemed to me that people I met were looking for some kind of personal connection that would explain why I was interested in this topic. Some story, perhaps, that could help bridge the gap of foreignness. Unfortunately, I didn't have such a story to tell. Before this project, I had no personal relationships to Seventh-day Adventism or anyone who was a Seventh-day Adventist. I never even heard of the church. I had traveled through Central America and witnessed the religious transformation from Catholicism to various forms of evangelical and especially Pentecostal Christianity, which did instigate my curiosity. But for the most part, I was simply looking for a good case study for a broader historical question I was interested in. How did late 19th century global transformation and especially the expansion of capitalism, influence the religious lives and beliefs of people in the Americas. Because I was interested in the Americas rather than a specific country or region, looking at a mission station that brought together people from several parts of the continent seemed to be a good starting point. I knew that the way converts and missionaries experience conversion, in its double sense of changing one's own religion and convincing someone else to change their religion, would be a question I was interested to address. For that, sorry. For that, I would need sources on both missionaries and converts. And sources on converts, I thought, would probably be harder to find. And my best bet was to find a case in which a new religion actually made significant inroads into local communities, one where it influenced the local religious landscape, even if only on a district level, and therefore also left behind footprints in the shape of historical documents. Finding such a case took some time. Generally speaking, Protestant missionaries that arrived in Latin America during the 19th century generated little interest. Take Guatemala, for example. This country has experienced a major religious transformation in the past few decades. And today, about 40% of its population, that's around 7 million people, belong to an evangelical or Pentecostal church. But in 1920, the country was still very much under a Catholic monopoly. At that time, Guatemala's entire Protestant population was less than 2,000 people. The membership in each of the biggest churches in Guatemala City was under 300. In Peru, things didn't seem any more promising. In 1918, there were 8 Protestant denominations in the country besides the Seventh-day Adventists, the largest of which was the Methodist Episcopal Church, who had arrived in the country around 1890. It had about 1,000 members. People across Latin America did not seem eager to leave the pews of the Catholic Church. Eventually, a colleague mentioned that the Seventh-day Adventists were relatively influential in Puno and suggest I looked into their work. And so my journey toward this book began. The Lake Titicaca Seventh-day Adventist Mission stood out among Protestant missions because of its success in attracting converts. Specifically, it attracted Aymara people who lived in independent communities around the lake. In 1910, there were a few dozen men and even less women practicing Seventh-day Adventist in Puno. A decade later, the church had 7,000 converts. According to my calculations, in 1930, between 10 to 15% of the population in some of the districts close to the lake belonged to the Adventist Church. In the long run, Seventh-day Adventists became a social, economic, and intellectual elite, and church members were salient in local politics. So, returning to the question that set me on this journey in the first place, how did the expansion of capitalism influence the religious lives and beliefs of people in the Americas in this case study? The book's title, Sacrifice and Regeneration, refers to the distinct ways missionaries and converts understood conversion and the various forces that led people to engage with conversion. The book is divided into 3 parts: converts, missionaries, and the mission. The first part focuses on the Aymara converts. It demonstrates that the leading converts were Army veterans, young men who returned home after years of military service, only to discover that nothing was the same. The expansions of the haciendas had basically turned some of them into landless peasants, or, in the better case, to peasants that constantly had to fight local strongmen, neighbors, and family members in order to regain access to natural resources that they once had at their disposal. Other challenges, such as cultural barriers, also stood in the ways of the veterans' reintegration into the indigenous rural community. Veterans learned some Spanish in the barracks. They adopted new tastes and new habits. Other community members, especially local mestizos, were not happy about these changes, and they usually reacted with oral and physical violence, sometimes even imprisonment. The Seventh-day Adventist Church provided these veterans with new career paths, particularly through the educational system the church had helped establish. Ferdinand Stahl, the most prominent and first missionary in Puno, is commonly remembered as saying that the best person to educate the Indian is the Indian himself. But more importantly, I think, religious conversion offered veterans and converts in general a way to reinterpret their Indianness, to reshape what it meant to be an Indian in the early 20th century Andes, rather than accept hegemonical notions by others of what being an Indian meant in terms of a person's social status. In converts' eyes, religious conversion implied racial regeneration, or more specifically, the reconstruction of Indianness in a manner that allowed the incorporations of characteristics associated to the mestizo world, but, and this is an important but, at the same time, rejected notions of mestizaje, or in other words, what the converts were claiming is that they could remain Indian and speak Spanish and dress as they like and get an education. Nevertheless, adopting new ideas about what it meant to be an Indian included also reconfiguration of one's obligations towards the community. Converts, for example, refused to provide labor to local authorities. It was very common for people to build roads, and converts simply refused to do that. Instead, they claimed that their national and communal obligations laid in teaching their children to read and write Spanish and in their previous army service. This was a constant source of tension between Adventist converts on the one side and the Catholic community members and even within families. The second part of the book focuses on missionaries. Missionaries also experience the implications of the expanding capitalist market. Missionaries usually grew up in the rural Midwest of the United States, and they came of age at a time of shifting opportunities. Becoming an independent farmer, like their parents, and like most Seventh-day Adventists were overwhelmingly rural, even in comparison to the places in the Midwest. They were mostly independent farmers. Was becoming very expensive and risky. Moreover, most of the missionaries that arrived in Puno were precisely the sons that did not have good inheritance prospects. In other words, within the family structure, they were especially exposed to the ramifications of capitalism. By contrast, the growth of corporate United States and the expansion of new white-collar middle class created new professional opportunities for those who could afford an education. Luckily for Adventists, they usually came from the upper rural middle class and could attend college. However, once they were on the job market, Adventists discovered they faced a problem. The expanding market turned time, and time is very, very important in Seventh-day Adventism, into a commodity. Instead of a task-oriented work regime, where people could fulfill certain seasonal tasks at their own time, now more people had to be in an office or the factory in certain hours and on certain days of the week. So if in the past, or their fathers or grandfathers could not work on Saturday, the seventh day, as Seventh Adventists shouldn't, and instead work on Sunday, now when looking for a job in an office, they faced problems. And Adventists wrote a lot about the problems they were facing within the job market. Observing the seventh day rather than Sunday conflicted with the standardization of the work week from Monday to Saturday. Simply, Adventists discovered that their religious beliefs conflicted with the job market. Under these circumstances, the Seventh-day Adventist Church itself became an important employer and provided jobs for its own members. One of the possibilities was to join the foreign field as a missionary. So missionaries left the mission field in part as an answer to the own challenges they were facing back home. However, a white-collar middle-class identity accompanied missionaries across the ocean and up the Andes. In fact, it shaped their experiences inasmuch as their middle-class expectations, and specifically middle-class material expectations, came to be understood as sacrifice. And specifically the comforts that they would have had they stayed in the United States, but chose to give up in order to save the poor Indian soul, as they themselves often describe what they were doing in the mission. Now, it is important for me to point out that converts and missionaries shared a kind of similarity. They were mainly young people, mostly men. Women usually followed as wives or as converts, and then they married. They were in their 20s, and they were the people that were especially vulnerable to these changing, to the changing economy. This is significant because scholarship on missions usually tends to emphasize difference. Scholars have been debating missionaries' role in empire building and their contribution to what is commonly known as cultural imperialism. Some scholars, especially those writing in the 1980s, contend that missionaries were essentially imperialist agents who imposed their own worldview on natives. More recently, scholars have challenged this view, arguing that it deprives converts of agency. Yet in both cases, the debate itself accentuates national identities, cultural gaps, and power relations. The difference in culture and power structure between missionaries and converts, it's undisputable. Of course, this exists. But at the same time, identifying the commonalities is important. It shows 19th century missionary was a result of a complex global forces that pushed missionaries out of their home communities, just as it did to converts, even if from a very, very different position. And I will also say that sometimes the similarities between people were even closer. For example, some of the leading converts and leading missionaries were orphans. They did not have fathers. I think this was not, I think the circumstances, but it does kind of say something about personal experiences. The final part of the book brings sacrifice and regeneration, or converts and missionaries, together and examines the dynamics between them. It shows that there was a dependency between the sides, even if an unequal one, as long as each side was able to fulfill its own aspirations, the partnership worked. However, when converts could no longer achieve the social, cultural, and political goals through the mission, or when allowing converts to pursue certain goals entailed sacrifices that missionaries were unwilling or unable to make, tensions erupted. And this was the case in the early 1920s, a decade after Stahl arrived in Puno. When Stahl began his work in Puno, he decided to name the mission the Seventh-day Adventist Indian Mission to Lake Titicaca. Using the word Indian in the mission's title was an unusual choice at the time. Adventists and other Protestant missionaries, for that matter, commonly refrained from identifying themselves with a particular ethnic or racial group. In their eyes, their message was universal, and missions preferred to describe themselves in geographical terms that had also more to do with demarcations of bureaucratic units within the church itself. And these often changed. So it began as a Peruvian mission and then moved to be the Lima mission when another mission opened up, and so forth. So the Seventh-day Adventists had the Paraná mission and the Ecuador mission and the mission to Puno and the mission to Peru and so forth. And the Lake Titicaca Indian mission was different. The reasoning behind that was just to appeal to the widest audience possible. Stahl, however, moved to Puno from La Paz, where Baptists did use specific ethnic and racial descriptions in mission names. Moreover, his own experiences as a trained medical nurse in that city led him to believe that it would be impossible to offer religious services to both Indians and Spanish people, as he called them. He often wrote that once a person gives medical treatment or religious, spiritual treatment to indigenous people, the Spanish people stop working with them and don't call him anymore. So when he arrived in Puno, he created the mission as an exclusive indigenous mission. At least part of the Adventist success is indebted to this step, because it provided converts with a space for racial regeneration and the reconstruction of power structures without what they knew from the other Andean surroundings. As long as the mission was an Indian mission, it flourished and membership grew. In 1920, however, Stahl left the mission, which was in dire economic situation, and the other missionaries blamed him for it. His replacement came from Lima and had little experience in the life and the politics and social relations in the highlands. His main task at the time was to move the missions from the bad economic situation that was into self-sufficiency. So to appeal to a wider audience and a more affluent populations, the missionaries decided to drop the word Indians from the mission title, and then began in a series of steps aimed to attract mestizos into the church. One of them was the creation of the Puno English School that was supposed to sort of introduce mestizos to Seventh-day Adventism. Hopefully, they would convert. And these steps profoundly changed the dynamics within the church. The indigenous converts lost their centrality, and they also lost part of their negotiation power vis-a-vis the missionaries, even though mestizos did not convert in significant numbers. So it's not like the church now had a significant mestizo population, but because missionaries were trying to attract mestizos, that curtailed what the converts could get from them, which before was much more. They had more room for maneuvering. Parallelly, during this time, leading converts had decided to join an organization called the Comité por Derecho Indígena Tawantinsuyu. The Comité was an organization established in 1919 after the demise of the Asociación por Indígena, which was the first organization to fight for indigenous rights. And its aim was to promote indigenous rights. It was also quickly endorsed by President Leguía at the time. But missionaries, even though officially it was endorsed, were very suspicious about this organization. There was a few reasons for that. It was in part because of their attempts to attract mestizos who despised it. In part, it was because they decided it was a communist organization. In part, because missionaries were afraid to get involved in politics, not understanding that being a missionary and converting people in the highlands was politics. And in part, it was simply because the idea of Tawantinsuyu, the mythic Inca Empire, with its own religion and gods, seemed to be blasphemy. Missionaries, therefore, presented converts with an ultimatum: the church or the comité. When converts refused to choose, they were excommunicated. Now, the mission paid a price for this excommunication. The number of converts declined throughout the 20s. Nevertheless, converts paid a higher price, a higher personal price. They lost their jobs, they lost their incomes, and they lost their community. The ultimatum in this regard illuminates the power structures within the church. Although there was mutual dependency, it existed, missionaries eventually had the power to give converts ultimatums and not the opposite. It is also at this point that the Seventh-day Adventism began to transform into a much more conservative force in the Andes. So if during the 1910s, it was sort of a place where indigenous activists could meet and work together, now these activists were excommunicated, and slowly the church became a much more conservative force, and also by extension of that, much more acceptable among mestizos. So if in the 1910s they only worked at independent indigenous communities, in the 1920s and close to the 1930s, we also find there's documentation of hacienda owners saying that some of the people on their hacienda are Seventh-day Adventists, and it's fine, and they don't bother anyone. This is also the point that my journey, at least in this book, ended, and it finishes in the 1930s. And sorry. And the next project is to come, I guess. If I have a few more minutes, I'm not sure I do. would be happy to say just a few words about the research behind it.
Yeah, of course, please do.
I'm not just 5 minutes. As I said, it was hard to. When I chose a case, it was very important to me to try and find converts' perspectives, and I knew it would be a challenge because many of these people, even when they did learn something in the Adventist schools, they didn't have a high level of fluency in Spanish or in local languages, and there was also a question of preservation. At the end, what I was able to do and how I was able to find the converts' perspective was basically by creating two very different databases and sort of comparing between them. One was based on sources that were closer to the church, lists or name dropping that missionaries said that this and this person belonged to the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and sort of make a list. And the other source was documents in Puno's regional archive throughout the years, simply to go through those documents and sort of look for names within the documents. And once I compared them, then information about the converts and about their background sort of popped up, which convert submitted a complaint on what. And that is sort of how I was able to get something about who they were, fact that they were Army veterans. Usually these sources don't say that they're Adventist because it was illegal. So it was only through the comparison that made it possible. And I think I'm going to stop the share right now.
Great. Thanks so much, Yael. Really interesting presentation. Anna, is it okay if I turn to you and you can lead with the first comment, please?
Yes, of course. Thank you for the presentation. It's great to hear you talk about the kind of questions that you were asked as well, because that's something as a reader that's quite engaging to sort of think about how people come to study the topics that they do and what drives them. So I have a few points that I wanted to highlight, and then perhaps a couple of questions that we could talk about. Firstly, I think, as came out in the presentation, this book highlights the politics of religious conversion. And it shows that for Indians in Puno, conversion to Seventh-day Adventism was less about an individual's spiritual experience, which is perhaps the part that people dwell on, and more about what Seventh-day Adventism gave access to. And this could be access to education and social mobility, but it could also be about evading the demands, both political and economic, of the local political structure. And I think that's one of the real strengths of the book, is to highlight the kind of the way that religious conversion comes out of kind of the constraints of the local political context, and then in turn to show how that conversion impacts on those local politics. And in a kind of link point, it also sheds light on the cross-fertilization between religious and secular organizations and political activism. So, as Yael points out, missionaries themselves were somewhat oblivious to how conversion to Seventh-day Adventism might trigger this sort of political activism. But the prevalence of Adventists among the Asociación Pro Indígena, the one that preceded the comité that Yael discussed, demonstrates how breaking away from traditional religious and political practices opened up new spaces for contestation that in some ways propelled converts into participating in other forms of activism. In other words, once you kind of started to question the basics of your religious affiliation, then that opens up other kinds of questioning and positioning in both the local and national society. And this is something that I've seen in my own research on Catholic radio in the Andes, and I've seen how kind of local radio stations, may have started out with a kind of intense missionary purpose, but they actually got co-opted and then incorporated into wider indigenous political struggles and kind of land rights issues as well. So I think it's really valuable to show those connections, to show how that kind of plays out in Peruvian politics. But this point also poses serious archival challenges when it comes to tracking who these converts were and what activities they engaged in. So rather than being contained within an homogenous group and confined to activities at the mission station, these converts actually sort of crop up unexpectedly in ways that are both revealing, as I've indicated, but perhaps also infuriating from an historian's point of view. And I wondered if you could talk about that sort of later on, and how the kind of creative strategies you had to come up with in terms of tracing these individuals and identifying them. You mentioned the database, but I think that there are other strategies you used as well. The book also makes important contributions to our understanding of globalization and its fallout during the first half of the 20th century. It shows that in different ways and to different extents, both Indians in Puno and Adventist missionaries from the United States were responding to the economic pressures and social dislocation that occurred in a rapidly industrializing and globally connected world. So as Yael pointed out, for Indians, this was about the kind of population growth and lack of access to land that had also been accelerated by land grabs conducted by expanding haciendas. For missionaries, it was about the difficulty in sustaining status and wealth as freeholders in the context of global competition and mechanized agriculture. And the book is clear that the position of missionaries was always more privileged and secure than the Indians they came to convert. But I think placing them within the same frame of analysis is very revealing. It gets away from the idea of globalization as a Western-led phenomenon in which the global South was always unnecessarily reacting and playing catch-up, and helps us to see the dislocations that occurred simultaneously. And I think it's really interesting to think about sort of how those apparent differences between Indian and missionary could actually sort of mask other points of continuity and similarity, and what can we make of those similarities then? And lastly, I don't want to overrun my point. I wondered, since my own research is focused on kind of Catholic missionary, but other kinds of Catholic involvement in Andean politics, I wondered to what extent these Adventists are in competition with other denominations, how they dealt with that competition. Was this something they explicitly discussed in their archives or in their correspondence? Or alternatively, were they very much the only actors there? And is it the case that other denominations then kind of sought to emulate what the Adventists had achieved in Puno in particular? I'll leave it there, and I really enjoyed the book.
Thank you.
Great. Paula, do you want to take from there? And then after that, Yael, maybe you could have a response to those two comments, please.
Yep, great, thanks. So I've organized my comments around the various contributions that I identified in the book. I mean, the first point is that clearly this book is an important contribution to the history of Protestantism in Peru. The history of religion in Peru is not a particularly big field. Certainly if we look at the modern period, And it's still in some ways dominated by the work of scholars like Father Geoffrey Claver, who wrote an authoritative history of the Catholic Church. There have been some recent contributions to this field, and I want to draw your attention to the work of Riccardo Cubas Ramaciotti, whose work on the rise of social Catholicism in the early 20th century in some ways offers a parallel to what you're looking at, because he looks at the ways in which Catholicism develops a kind of social dimension. In his case, if I'm not mistaken, he focuses on Arequipa, but there is a sort of, I think, in part in reaction to the role of Protestantism, but also to the work of the Comité Tahuantinsuyo, as you point out. So I think maybe there's something there for you to explore a bit further. In relation to Protestantism more specifically, of course, the work of scholars like Fernando Armas and Juan Fonseca has opened lots of very rich seams of research. And so I see your book as building on this scholarship, but taking it in new and exciting directions by looking more closely at the local level and at how Protestantism and more specifically Adventism played out in a particular social and political context, whereas their work tends to be more kind of national and general. I also found the attention to the veterans in the book very interesting and an important contribution. And this is a contribution that perhaps is a little under-acknowledged in the book to the history of the military and of the armed forces in Peru. In some ways, this is a field that is even less developed than the history of religion. And most of what has been written on the history of the military is of quite old-fashioned institutional military history type of writing. Though some of it, like the work of Daniel Masterson that you draw on, is quite helpful, I find. But there's hardly any new work that reflects what elsewhere is called the new military history, which focuses less on, the official history of the armed forces and more on the narratives, the discourses of the military about society, and also on the experience of military service. There is some recent work which has started to change this, and this is work that combines kind of social and cultural history with more institutional perspectives. I'm thinking, for example, of the work of Lourdes Hurtado on the military during the Velasco period, David Velázquez Silva, who looks at military narratives about indigenous populations, and also very important work by Carlos Camacho, who looked at the 1933 war with Colombia. And for earlier periods, there's work of Natalia Sobrevilla, Cecilia Mendez, and others. But your work on the army veterans, I think, opens again, a very rich seam. We know that military leaders viewed conscription as a way to civilize the indigenous population. They believed that, like education, sanitation, or some forms of labor, conscription would address the inherent backwardness of the Indians and uplift them. And maybe, we could talk here of a sort of military indigenismo, similar to the official indigenismo of the 1920s, which found expression in a range of fields, from literature to art and architecture, and also in policies towards the indigenous. And, in my work on the history of prostitution and venereal disease, I found that military officers, particularly military doctors, worried that recruits who return to their communities might bring back some unwelcome diseases like syphilis and gonorrhea. And this is why they were quite keen on what they called at the time sex education, which they believed could reduce the risk of contagion. So there were these concerns about veterans returning home, as it were. But on the whole, they viewed, these military officers viewed conscription as integral to nation-building efforts, since, as I said before, they believed that it could address the Indians' backwardness. Like other forms of intervention, conscription would help de-Indianize the Indian. So I see your research as adding further complexity to this story, because of course you analyze this process from the perspective of the veterans in a way that hardly anyone has done. And this adds a fascinating layer to the experience of return from conscription and how it contributed then to the veterans' links to Adventism. And I think Peruvian historians who are interested in thinking of new ways about the history of the military will find the discussion you develop in chapters 2 and 3, I think, very compelling. Now, beyond the issues of the historical fields to which you're contributing, the book offers a very compelling interpretation of the reasons for conversion, and Anna already pointed to this. Particularly important is your attempt to explore the connections between the veterans and Adventism in a manner that focuses on what the veterans hope to get out of that relationship. And so in a sense, perhaps what you are doing is a history of conversion from below that is attentive to how Indigenous people understood Adventism and what it was that they could get out of it for their own benefit. A third and I think final aspect of the book that I found very interesting is the analysis that you offer of the Adventist missionaries' backgrounds and the economic and social factors that shaped their missionary campaigns. Again, something that Anna touched on. In some ways, the missionaries who arrived in Puno came from farming backgrounds that were not too dissimilar from those of the indigenous communities they ended up amongst. But there were important differences, and these differences were maintained in numerous ways, as you show, and how racism and notions such as comfort and respectability articulated these differences is an issue that reminds me of David Parker's analysis of the Lima middle class in the same period. Whiteness, Parker showed, implied a certain performance of middle classness, which even quite poor middle class people had to undertake in order to maintain that status. For the US Adventists, a performance of respectability through forms of consumption was equally essential to maintaining their status. Now, the key insight or argument of the book can perhaps be summed up by one sentence on page 172. I quote, "Both sides needed each other." But this did not mean that their goals were perfectly aligned. Mission work was essential for the Adventists in achieving their religious quests. Their presence created opportunities that Indigenous people could take advantage of in a context that was highly unfavorable to their own interests. Adventism offered a platform from which to challenge the local status quo, the landed power holders, the gamonales, the Catholic Church. That the missionaries in the end reproduced their own form of official indigenismo, aiming to uplift the backward Indians, did not matter as much as the fact that the schools and their very presence introduced a challenge to the ways things had been before that could be instrumentalized. For the same reason, as you show in the last chapter, when bottom-up forms of indigenismo, such as the Comité Tahuantinsuyo, took root, the allure of Adventism as an intermediary for indigenous economic, social, and political objectives began to wane. And so in some ways, this is a story of how both sides needed each other until one side didn't need the other quite so much. Thanks.
Thanks, Paolo. Yael, do you want to maybe just respond to whatever you think would be pertinent there?
First of all, thank you so much for insightful comments and for taking the time and everything. I'll start maybe with what Anna asked and a little bit more about the sources. I'll share, we're a small group, that when the book is based on my PhD research, and when I put in the proposal, one of the way it's done here, one of the answers I got back was, "This is a great idea. I'm not sure you will be able to find converts' perspective at this time." And then I said, no, we are going to find the convert's perspective. it was very important to me to find a way to incorporate. That was basically what I was interested in. And that is also why I looked for, as I said at the beginning, a case that would have created a lot of sources, a case that would probably create conflicts with the Catholic Church, because I thought that if there were conflict with the Catholic Church, it would be likely that Catholic priests or locals would write about them. And I knew it would be very hard to find local Protestant archives from those early years. I didn't know why, and I was later told that it was sort of a custom for the missionaries to take the archives back with them to the United States, which is interesting in and of itself. And that is why I looked for some place that was sort of a success story. And when I reached the archives in Puno, I worked in the Prefectura archive and in the bishop's archive, which I had to gain access to personally. The archive sort of belongs to the bishop, and he decides if he wants you to use it or not. And in Lima, it's not like that. In Lima, you come, you fill like 3 zillion forms, and a day or two you come later and they tell you you can come in. But in Puno, I had to write ahead of time and tell him I was coming, introduce myself, and so on. And when I did arrive at the archive, the bishop wasn't there. He went to Ayacucho for something or other, and it was raining and he got stuck there. And the person that was in charge let me in the room of, it's not even an archive, it's just a room with boxes, but told me I couldn't open the boxes with the documents inside. And I just stand there, I didn't know what to say. And then I said, please call the bishop and ask him if you can not only let me in the room, but also let me open the documents. And he said, okay, come back in 2 days, which I did. And then they let me open, they even gave me a key to this room, and I could open the documents, open the boxes and take out the documents. So that was one. And the second was the Prefectura, which was actually, they were extremely efficient. I mean, I was shocked by how good and organized and helpful they were. And these two are very, very different sorts of documents. The documents within the regional archive had a lot of the kinds of information I was looking for, sort of land struggles, a little bit about the backgrounds of the people. I was lucky to find a criminal report, and that had that gave more background. But they never said if a person belonged to the Seventh-day Adventist Church or not, because until 1915, it was illegal. And even after that, it wasn't something people wanted to talk about. So the problem was finding the documents that mentioned the right people. So I would be able to say, okay, these are Adventist converts, these are their life trajectories, whatever I can find about. So what I ended up doing, as I said, was making 2 lists. One of names, some from the Catholic Church, because the Catholic Church did accuse specific people by name, and other from documents from the Seventh-day Adventist publications or missionary letters. Here and there were also like news reports. It was amazing to me that Adventists, this region, got quite a bit of newspaper attention, and sometimes it wrote, these people, Manuel Camacho, Juan Velasquez, were on a mission to Lima, and they met with so-and-so, and then I had names. So I took these people's names. On the one hand, I think at the end I had about almost 300 names. And then I took about maybe 800 documents from the areas that I was interested. I knew that had a lot of Seventh-day Adventist activities. And I went document, and put it in an Excel with the names of the specific people that are in that document. And yes, it took a very long time. And after that, I could compare. Where the big problem there was, and I found maybe, I don't know, among the 800, 100 documents of various complaints that people with the same names submitted. But then there was a problem of, are these the same people? Because, for example, Mariano was a very popular name. And in a certain location, they're from the same family. And then in Ayu, the people are from, they all have the same last name. So it was the problem was, how do you know that this person is that person, is the person I want? So with the most dominant cases, for example, Manuel Camacho, who was a very was an activist. He established the first Adventist school. He had good command of written Spanish, and he had signed his name, so I quickly was able to identify his signature and life details, so I knew that was him. And there maybe another 2 or 3 people that were prominent like that, but the rest, it was looking for other information in the documents. So if a person, for example, complained that he was forced to drink alcohol, that usually had to do with Adventism. And then Adventists, I saw, you sort of depended on one another. So if I had a document and I would be able to say, okay, I know these 4 people are definitely Adventists, I already recognize their signature, I know the way they write it, I have that, then it was very, very lucky that number 5 and number 6 also belonged to the church. They usually had the same people and they worked together as a community. And I think at the end of this, I had information, and I can't remember exactly, but about 30 people, some sort of background information, saying that they were veterans, saying that they were in land struggles and so forth. And that's how I was able to construct this picture, which I know in advance it's not perfect, of course, but I do think it gives some insights or a good enough picture, the outlines of what was going on. So that's about the sources. Regarding competition with other denominations, Adventists are considered outsiders within U.S. Protestantism. They're a product. The church is a product of the Second Great Awakening and of the Millerite movement. Miller was a prophet who said that Jesus is coming back on a certain date. He didn't come back on that date, as we all know, and the movement sort of disappeared. It's called the Great Disappointment, and the Adventists were the people who said that he made some mistakes, but the basics are right. Okay, I'm really generalizing. And they were looked at as kind of weird people. They weren't exactly Protestants. They didn't know how to place them. So when they arrived in Latin America, their relationship with other denominations were kind of tense. And if there were ecumenical meetings, a lot of times they weren't invited, or they were invited and they didn't want to come because they didn't see themselves as part of the larger Protestant movement. And I do think that their experience in Latin America, vis-a-vis the Catholic Church, kind of pushed them towards mainstream Protestantism. They kind of saw themselves now that it was them and the other Protestants. They knew they were the Americans or British people there, and they were now vis-a-vis the Catholic Church in a country that didn't allow freedom of religion. And these experiences kind of pushed them more into mainstream Protestantism. On the other hand, certain problems they were having in the United States, specifically around the Saturday, observing Saturday and working on Sunday, that created a lot of problems. Also in finding jobs, as I said, but also, for example, in blue laws that forbid people to open their businesses on Sunday. Adventists had a problem with that. They actually worked against that in Congress with Jewish congregations. And in the 1930s, some of that kinds of works out, and they're sort of pushed more into mainstream Protestantism. But that is a bit after my period. In Puno, they were the only church other than the Catholic Church until I think the mid-1920s. Okay, the Methodists at some point have a little bit of at the beginning of 19, but it doesn't really catch. And they are the only ones working there. And they are known not as Adventists necessarily. They are called by locals Evangélicos, Protestantes, y Adventistas. They do not, for the locals, the difference, the theological differences aren't very important. For them, I think for the converts, as well as for local hacienda owners, other community members, mestizos, they're Protestant, they're not Catholic. And the attitudes are a lot from that point, from them not being Catholic, not being part of the system, not accepting the system, not accepting the authority of the system, because politics and religion, and I think for me this was actually the most interesting part, are intertwined. I mean, for the missionaries, and perhaps this is what shocked them, they came from a place where there was a difference between politics and religion. It's a state, or at least state and religion. Okay, in the Andes and in the local communities, this it didn't exist on the national level, and it didn't exist in the local community. If you wanted to move up the prestige system, you had both political and religious duties. It came together, and this idea of separation of religion and state, or religion and political authority, didn't exist. So I think for the converts, the act of conversion was political from the start. They were sort of rejecting everything. They were rejecting the local political community, authority within the community, and everything that came with it. For missionaries, thought that they were making sort of a personal religious choice. And then in the 1920s, when these activists also joined the comité, the missionaries are saying, why are you involving politics? And these converts are sort of kind of looking at them, and they, now you remembered? I mean, why are you telling us this? This is what we have been doing all the time. And there's something here that they simply, and at that point, it kind of, everything kind of goes apart, or at least the radical and more political part of the indigenous leadership leaves, and the more conservative part stays, and the church kind of changes its face. And today it is relatively a conservative church. I will tell Paulo that I know and like Ricardo's work. I also met him. I think he's even quoted, and I think that that you're right. You're correct. There is a lot of things that sort of the works that go together. When I began this work, and I think I said this in another place, I sort of stumbled on the military and on military indigenismo. It wasn't what I was looking for. My questions were more from the history of religion. And maybe it's important to sort of widen that view and say that the veterans that reached the Adventist Church were one group. There were other veterans who found themselves in other places, and I'll be a little bit more specific. When people came back to the community, they depended on their families. if the family was able to help them reintegrate, strong enough economically to help them reintegrate to the community, protect their property, their paths were, I don't know, paved or easier. But in cases where families were in conflict, and sometimes perhaps we should remember that people were sent to the military to get rid of them, young men, because of conflict. So in the first place, people were sent, they didn't want them. Then when they came back, either their community was part of an hacienda or other family members. Sometimes it's within the family, took over whatever plots they had, or pasture lands that the entire community used to use. Now only certain person sort of, they were privatized. This happened in one case that I found with a small stream. So now certain people, a stream that before everyone could access with their animals, now someone took over and didn't let these veterans access with their animals to the stream, and didn't give them access. So they had to fight for these resources. So the group of veterans who had it hard, let's say, they didn't have families to support them, the state didn't give anything, they had to find their way back. The Seventh-day Adventist Church was one way. Others, I found, just became sort of parts of private armies for local hacienda owners. They were now in charge of the hacienda security. That was another way. And the third way was becoming a bandit. So and so there was an army, and now he is a bandit. So those are, again, this is not research that I did just things that I stumbled across while researching something else. But those were the other possibilities that standed before these people. And I agree. I mean, I think it's an important question. Also, when you think in longer terms of militarization of societies, the role of veterans, what happens to people when they leave civic life, what role do they play, what do they take from the military with them into civil society? It doesn't go away, believe me. And you take these experiences, and at the end of the day, it makes a certain culture. So if people are interested in the militarization, I think veterans are a very important link.
Thanks, Yael. That was a really helpful response. Why don't we open it up to questions from anyone in the audience? Feel free just to go ahead if you have a question, either in chat or on audio.
I mean, maybe I can just pick up on that
Sure.
last point. Yeah, I mean, I think what you were saying towards the end is key, right? I mean, at the moment in Peru, there's this kind of moral panic about veterans, right? As a potential kind of counter-hegemonic force that could be mobilized and whipped up against the government, right? And the key figure there is the former president Ollantumala's brother, Antaurumala, who was in jail until quite recently. It was released, and he has this sort of discourse about that appeals to the veterans as a potentially an important force. I think in practice, it is a sort of moral panic in the sense that the force isn't as strong as some people claim. But it's true that there are a lot of people in Peru who have gone through the army and have a lot of grievances today, which which are largely ignored by successive governments. And so reading your book in the context of the last elections in Peru, when these veteranos or reservistas, as they're known, were very much on the front page, made me think that, that although maybe this wasn't the main focus of your book, I think you've hit on something that needs further development that other historians can maybe pick up on, because they're a key social actor that most people have just not paid a great deal of attention to. And I think precisely for the reasons that you point to. I mean, some may have been sent away, but others will have been forcefully recruited, right? I mean, I think that the leva was a big phenomenon in this period, where people were just kind of picked up off the street and conscripted. And so, and in some ways that continues today. But anyway, I think there are some very interesting parallels, both in terms of how they end up in the military, but also what happens to them when they return to civil life, and the question of reintegration, and where do they find a kind of a political community. And it would be interesting to see whether Protestantism continues to serve that role for that particular social group. Is there a higher proportion of former military in Protestant churches in Peru? I don't know, but that might be something to follow up on.
I'll say that when I looked at veterans, I think that there's also a general, at least in Latin American history, but maybe even beyond, of sort of work on Army veterans. As you said, and that's also correct, I also felt that that was missing sort of like a good social history of the military. There is a book by Elizabeth, I cannot remember the last name right now, on Bolivia, on the military in Bolivia. And if someone's interested, I can look it up. It's relatively recent, which is sort of a social history of the military, but there are not many. And work on what happens to people once they leave the barracks, particularly from a social perspective, is practically non-existent in Latin America. There are a few works in Africa. There's some things that have to do with veterans after World War II, because after World War I, because they were so important to World War II, or to the rise of Nazi Germany and in the USSR also, but it's not. There's not a lot of it, and I did find that kind of intriguing, just as I found intriguing the fact that historiography of religion or Christianity in Latin America stops at the beginning of the 19th century. It's like colonial is over, and so is the Catholic Church, and that's it. And now religion is not important. And I also thought a lot about that. I mean, where does that come from? And I think that has to do both from liberalism and sort of this idea that religion is going to disappear, so why deal with it? That's one. And the other thing is that it's not, when you think about sort of more Marxist interpretations of history, religion isn't like a very it's not very sexy or appealing. I mean, it doesn't have a rebellious aura to it. And
well, unless it's theology of liberation, then it gets sexy again.
And so I think, but it is. I mean, now there are a few works, and the Maryknoll missionaries in Puno were in the 60s or the 50s. I think they were very. They used a lot of radio as school, and I think even there's a guy that wrote about it. Noah something, he's German or Swiss, about their work in radio. And there's more and more and more work about Protestantism, but it's still relatively small. And about veterans, really nothing, even though they are important for, even on a family basis. I mean, what do you bring from the barracks into family life, into creating family life?
Great. Do we have any other questions?
Okay.
Okay. If not, then I would just want to say thank you so much to Yael for this book, for doing the presentation, as well as to our commentators as well. I hope it's a good start for what is clearly a book that is fulfilling a big gap within the field. And I'm really excited to see where its trajectory will be. So thank you, Yael. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Paulo, for this event.
Thank you.
I just unmuted so that I could thank everybody for an amazing conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce.
Thank you.
for joining.